You need a magnifying glass to read the photochrome of Detroit. But this is one of America's earliest picture postcards. Everybody back then must have liked them just fine. They sold 7 million cards one year, and the competition was fierce. This bottom image shows up on an early German postcard. The photographer must have sold the negative to both companies. But if anything marks the early 20th century, it is that of change. And every year, Detroit Publishing would have to send another photographer across the river to update the card. The trend for cards across the country, as this card from Monterey, California demonstrates, the message size was shrinking while the image size was enlarging. 1907, the greatest invention in the history of the postcard, the divided back. This enabled Detroit Publishing to use the same negative for the next 15 years. They didn't need to get a photographer across the river, just get someone from the art department to add some feature to the already present negative. And you know it's 1910 when the building built with the proceeds of the postcard company goes up, the Dime Bank Building. In the early 20s, the Pontchartrain Hotel gives way to the Wrecking Ball, and up goes the First National Bank Building. 1930, and the final Detroit Publishing postcard of the riverfront is published. And, dear friends, this would be the end of our documentary had it not been for the fact that they made 18,000 different views all across America. Here's a 6-postcard panorama of the riverfront view of the city of Detroit, owned by Nancy Steckschulte. Every building and church rendered in perfect, colorful detail. As we move down the river, we come across a building where I spent too much of my misbegotten youth, the Wayne County Building, or Traffic Court. Fortunately, the city fathers, and the mothers too, saved this beautiful old building, and it's still around today. As we move further down the river, we can observe that the golden era of postcards and steamships coincided. Finally, we arrive at Woodward Avenue. On the left side are the West Siders, and on the right side, the East Siders. A streetcar ride up from the river, we arrive at the Pontchartrain Hotel. The leaders of the burgeoning auto industry used as a common ground for business contracts and to exchange ideas the lavish splendor of the 10-story Pontchartrain Hotel and its Tiffany lighting. Now, across the street, the majestic building used a German postcard company for their lithographs. The cards showed crisp, hard contrast, but when they added color, it didn't quite look as real as the Detroit Publishing cards did. So moving further down the river, we come across the old post office. Building went up in 1890 and came down in 1934. This is where you'd buy your stamps and your postal cards. And of course, nobody could prevent an English company named Tuck from coming and printing a card in Germany and selling it to the American market. Now, across the street from the post office was what we old newsmen like to refer to as the record of the day, the Detroit Journal. No longer here, they ceased publication in the mid-20s. But on this day, the Journal would print a story dear to the publisher's interests, because it was about the company itself. So for a penny, you could find the news of the day and learn about the publisher's other business interests. When you own the local newspaper, bank, shipping company, and publishing company, your influence is considerable. January 11th, 1900. Fine work in commercial art. Artistic products of the Detroit Photochrome Company, one of the young companies which has introduced a new commercial industry to Detroit, and in fact America, is that of the Photochrome Company, who occupy the block on 13th Street between Grant and Lincoln Streets. This company is only 2 years old in the manufacturing world, but already has built up a large business in the commercial advertising line, as well as the publishing of fine prints.
Ooh la la!
It employs a very high class of labor, consisting mostly of men skilled in photographic and artistic lines. It has done much to confirm the reputation Detroit has been acquiring recently of being a distributor of art goods. As most of its work has been outside of the city, it is far better known in the East, or even on the Pacific West, than in Detroit. It is the only company in America having the use of the photochrome process. Shortly after the commencement of manufacturing here, it developed a new photomechanical process called phostin, which bids fair to be used extensively in fine publications, booklets, and album work. A recent product of the work in its illustrated book for Hiram Walker and Sons is an exquisite brochure and marks a new advance in advertising art. Through its sister company, the Detroit Photographic Company, it distributes not only in America, but in Great Britain and on the continent, its ARC photographs of the best scenery of the world. And the name of the latter company may be seen on a major part of railroad advertising in the United States. Dr. H.A. Cleveland is president of the company, and W.A. Livingstone is its manager. Its directing staff includes H.H. Husher and W.H. Jackson. William Henry Jackson was famous as a landscape photographer. He had traveled around the world by the time he joined Detroit Publishing. He was a pioneer and a symbol of the Old West. But it was Jackson's partnership with Livingstone that gave us our first mass-produced images. William Livingstone, known as Sailor Bill, had published the Detroit Journal from 1883 to 1922. He was chairman of the Michigan delegation to the Republican National Convention. In 1896 and in 1900, they nominated William McKinley. McKinley was known as an agent of prosperity and was elected president under the slogan, "A full dinner pail." Regretfully, in September of 1901, while touring the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, in the Music Pavilion, a deranged man shot McKinley. For 8 days, his life hung in the balance. It would keep the reporters and editors of the journal busy speculating about the future for more than a week. Danger may soon be over. All is now favorable. President out of danger. Emma Goldman arrested. McKinley resting easily. Has a fighting chance. Doctors now believe President will get well. But stereo view of his funeral would dispute that. And what was to follow was a remarkable manifestation of mourning. The journal used thick black columns in mourning, and the Wilcox House would have its own postcard commemorating the event of the taking of the oath by Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was everyone's favorite, and they called him Teddy. He was a conservationist and led America onto the stage of superpowers. The first decade of the 20th century and the Golden Era postcards and the Roosevelt era coincided. People were living with a robust energy and better than they ever lived before. As Mark Sullivan would write in his book, Our Times, The Turn of the Century, we felt like we were living in a new world. Laws were becoming more just, rulers more humane, music is becoming sweeter and books wiser. Homes are happier, and the individual heart more genteel. In fact, 6 years was added to the average life expectancy in that time. When Livingstone's dime bank building went up in 1910, they were as close to city government as you could get. Although we lost City Hall in the 60s, the construction in Detroit never seems to come to an end. Of course, the biggest clue about the Detroit Publishing Company may come from this basement view of the dime bank building where they show the vault. You know, they say you can't take it with you, but they apparently did. I checked in there and there were no cards or no bills left. Up on the roof of the dime bank building, they made this postcard and called it the Heart of the City. I found the 20 by 24 print used to make this card at the Library of Congress in Washington. William Jackson must have used his large format camera, like the one on the floor here, to make that incredibly detailed photograph. Across the way on the top of the Wayne County building, the photographers used the same perch to obtain their bird's eye view of Cadillac Square. The obvious photo angle was to look up Michigan Avenue for the next 100 years of postcards. Back in the horse and buggy day, the German card makers used a simple lithograph. They could add color and use the same negative to make the night view. Next to City Hall Watch, the Russell House is replaced by the Pontchartrain Hotel. Must be 1903. Now in 1910, 5 extra floors were added. Now watch carefully, and you can see the dime bank building come in after 1910. And then in this 10-year interim, we can observe the presence of the automobile coming into being. no more parking. And this gives an indication of how rapidly the automobile became part of the American landscape. And in the 1970s, they returned the little park to its original state. If we go west on Michigan Avenue, we run into Soldiers and Sailors Monument. Made in 1872 by Randolph Rogers, it has what Hawkins Ferry writes is, "On top is a colossal personification of Michigan as a semi-civilized Indian queen, menacingly brandishing a sword and with her right hand clutching a shield." Other large industrial northern cities have their monuments to the Civil War, like this one in Indianapolis, Indiana. The ones in the South were of much simpler design and reflect how restoration was slower in this part of the country. Cleveland's was and is spectacular. In the Arcade, an early interior shopping mall, one could find the beginning of the motion picture and the phonograph, thanks to the innovative mind of Thomas Alva Edison. But the Detroit publishers used professionally trained photographers and would return here in 1911, where the new photographic technology would allow them to make photos of moving people. And finally, today, your own video camera renders the motion, sound, subtle colors in a realistic fashion. People traveled more these days, and as America's train stations grew, the publishers' photographers had to return to re-photograph Union Station and its expansion. These buggies would get you to the train on time. They must have been aware of the changes in their own lives they were facing to have produced such a wry joke as this card titled, "The Passing of the Horse." But this was the era of postcards, and at the same time, a leisurely walk in Elmwood Cemetery would turn into a leisurely drive in Elmwood Cemetery. Back in the mid-20s, the fashionable place to be buried was Woodmere Cemetery. This was the final resting place of the family that ran the shipping, bank, newspaper, and publishing company that gave us so many postcards. William Livingstone and William Allen Livingstone passed away in the mid-20s, and Robert Livingstone in 1936. And dear friends, this would be the end of our documentary had it not been for the fact that they wrote more about them after they were gone than they printed themselves. The Handbook of Detroit Publishing Company Postcards by Jeff Burdick was the first guide to the collector, followed in 1975 by James Lowe and Ben Papel's Detroit Publishing Company Collector's Guide. The most comprehensive is the final, by Nancy Steckschulte in 1994. This allows the collector a complete look at all of the cards they published. But the books never seemed to come to an end. In 1994, Jim Hughes published The Birth of a Century, Early Color Photographs of America. In 1997, the author of Wisconsin Death Trip published Dreamland, America at the Dawn of the 20th Century. Michael Lessie used century-old photographs from the Detroit Publishing Company. He views the world behind the images and questions their meaning. Colorado, 1870 to 2000, by John Fielder, explores the contrast between ancient photographs taken by William Henry Jackson and present-day color photographs of Colorado. Photochromes have been acquired and are sold across the internet by Christopher Cordozo of Minneapolis. William Henry Jackson, An Intimate Portrait, the Elmwood Bonnie Journal, gives a biographical sketch of the great photographer. When Detroit Rode the Waves by Michael Dixon in 2001. Encyclopedia of Antique Postcards by Susan Brown Nicholson. Samuel L. Schmucker, The Discovery of His Lost Art by Jack Davis and Dorothy Ryan. Books by and about Jackson are certainly plentiful. The Pioneer Photographer, Time Exposure, Picture Maker of the Old West, William Henry Jackson, The Transformation of the American Landscape.